Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bacetta, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be diving into some new research looking at the relationship between one's personality traits and their receptiveness to political ads on social media. And if we think about Cambridge Analytica, this was their whole spiel, right? They would build these psychological profiles of users and then target them with messages that were already deemed to be persuasive based on those users' personality traits. And I think the general consensus among the academic community and tech journalists and commentators is that that pitch was probably overstated. There's no real empirical evidence that supports this idea of psychological profiling working for political ads. And they're right in the sense that we don't have much empirical evidence to support that claim, but a new experiment does find evidence that there's a causal relationship between a person being persuaded by a political ad based on whether the text of that ad aligns with their psychological profile, measured here as introversion and extroversion. So if you're an extrovert and you receive a message tailored to an extrovert, it seems to be that you're more likely to have a positive feeling toward that party, and you're more likely to vote for that party. And there's an interesting mediating mechanism here, which is cognitive involvement in the message. And so that is, if you're an extrovert and you get an extroverted message, you pay more attention to that message, which in turn makes you more likely to vote for that party. Now, of course, it's probably not that deterministic. This is done in a very controlled setting, and we're not sure if these effects are sustainable over time, but it does provide preliminary evidence that there's more to psychological targeting than we might have originally thought. So my guest today is Dr. Brahim Zarouali. He is an assistant professor of persuasive communication at the University of Amsterdam, and he's also the lead author of that study entitled Using Automated Text Analysis to Investigate Political Microtargeting, Assessing the Persuasion Effects of Personality-Tailored Ads on Social Media, which is a great title, and we're going to break down that study step by step and dig a bit into its findings. We're also going to look at another one of Dr. Zarouali's studies that examines the depolarization potential of chatbots and basically measures participants' openness to their opposing view on the migration question based on whether news is presented to them by a website or a chatbot. And that paper is called Overcoming Polarization with Chatbot News, Investigating the Impact of News Content Containing Opposing Views on Agreement and Credibility. So another great title there. And both of these studies are unpublished, meaning they haven't been published yet and really are on the cutting edge of research. And I really love doing these type of interviews because not only does it provide you with what's really at the forefront of social media and politics, but it also is a great opportunity to go beyond the article and kind of beyond the study and really understand step by step the design of those experiments. I think that's really useful to know what these experiments reveal and also what are some of their limitations. But for me, it's really about thinking, how is this study conducted? And I think it's really useful, not just for, everyone listening, but particularly for, students and researchers to kind of dig a bit under the text and realize what were the motivations, limitations, and strengths of these experiments. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Brahim Zarouali. Again, he is an assistant professor in persuasive communication at the University of Amsterdam. Dr. Zarouali, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael.
So before we dive into your research on political microtargeting and chatbots, why don't we start out with a brief introduction into persuasive communication as a research field? It's a new topic for the podcast and one I'm not so familiar with myself. So what type of research have you been looking into within persuasive communication, and how might it relate to political communication?
Okay, so persuasive communication, as I see it, refers to any attempt to change the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of people as a result of an exposure to a message, so to a communication. And this can basically be any kind of communication, going from marketing communication to health communication to even political communication. For example, an ad obviously can be persuasive in swaying people to buy a specific product. In a similar vein, a news article can also be persuasive, for instance, convince people of certain arguments about an event or an issue, or think of certain notifications you would get from a health application that can also be persuasive. For instance, persuade you to become healthier by following recommendations. So persuasive communication, as I see it, can be very broadly defined and therefore makes it very interesting lens to look at contemporary topics. So for myself, I'm doing research really at the intersection of persuasive communication and media technologies by really looking at how technologies such as algorithms or chatbots influence people in what they think, feel, or do. So really looking at the effects of media technology on individuals, while at the same time also focusing on the broader implications for society as well. Now, how does this all relate to political communication? Well, from I think what I've just said, the link is pretty straightforward. Political communication is all about using communication campaigns, usually driven by recent technologies, to persuade citizens. So persuade people to vote, persuade people to change their attitude towards a political candidate or a party, change their beliefs about an important political issue, and so on. So persuasive communication could be really interesting to disentangle these contemporary political dynamics. Even more so, today, because political campaigns are heavily shaped by the forces of a commercialized social media marketplace. So maybe even more than ever, political communication might operate through logics that originate from persuasive and marketing communication. So that's my take on persuasive communication and political communication.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, there's a lot of talk about political ads for years now. And as you note in your studies, there hasn't been so much empirical work on that. And so that's why I'm excited to dive into these topics. And so the first experiment we're going to discuss, which is called, the paper is called Persuasion Effects of Personality Tailored Ads. And I think a good place to start for that is self-congruence theory. So can you outline what self-congruence theory is and how it's been used in persuasive communication?
Yeah, sure. So in a communication context, this theory basically argues that people prefer messages when they are in line or congruent with their own self-concept, so who they are. This theory was initially used by marketing scholars to explain that consumers preferred certain products and brands that matched their personal characteristics. But over time, this theory has also expanded to persuasive communication and in particular to advertising research, where the theory has been used to make a distinction between, for instance, congruent ads and incongruent ads. And based on the theory, the main claim or the main conception was that congruent ads are more effective than incongruent ads because they increase the personal relevance for the recipients. So that is, in a nutshell, congruence theory.
Right. It makes sense. We kind of want ads that align with who we think we are, who we want to be, right?
Exactly.
So to test the effectiveness of micro-targeted political ads, you use that theory and look at whether ads that are congruent with people's introversion and extroversion would affect their political attitudes and voting intention. So can you walk us through the basic idea behind that experiment, as well as kind of the basic structure of how it was designed?
Yeah, sure. So the basic idea behind the study was the public outcry after Cambridge Analytica, the scandal. So without entering into too much details, this scandal was centered around the fact that Cambridge Analytica built personality profiles of millions of Facebook users without their awareness, without their consent. And as a result of this, political ads were being served to people based on their personality. So ads that were congruent with people's personalities. And we know that this practice happened during the US presidential elections in 2016 and also during the Brexit referendum. So the questions that me and my colleagues, Tom Dobber and Claes de Vreese at the University of Amsterdam had or wanted to answer was, is this practice effective? Does this personality congruent advertising on social media work? So simply said, we wanted to somehow recreate Cambridge Analytica in a simplified, controlled environment. So what we did was develop this mock social networking site, a fake social networking site, which would then serve as the environment in which we could conduct the experiment. And The network was given the look and feel of Facebook and pretty much contained all the main functionalities and services of a real social platform, such as a homepage with a news feed containing posts that we, of course, had put there ourselves, a profile page, a friend list, like, share, and comment buttons, a chat function, and so on. So really trying to mimic the whole Facebook environment. And in this environment, we then tested whether serving people personality congruent ads was more effective than non-congruent ads in changing their voting intentions and political attitudes.
Right. And there's some couple really cool methodological ways that you sorted these participants into introverts and extroverts. But before we get into that, I tried to look into this for the episode, but I couldn't find it. I remember, I don't know if it was Cambridge Analytica, but one example was like targeting ads for a cruise. If you want to target extroverts, you target it like, come party on this cruise. And then if you want to target introverts, you have more of like, reading a book on the deck type of ad. Are you aware of that example, or is it just something that I came across?
No, I'm familiar with the study. It's a recent study, a field experiment where indeed they matched certain personality types with specific images and specific types of ads. And they found out that matching advertisements based on these personality traits was more effective in changing people's behavior. So there is some research out there, but it's very, very scarce and not really in a political context. So that really inspired us to somehow replicate this, but then in a more controlled political environment.
Right. Okay. Well, good. I'm not pulling that out of nowhere. It's just something that I didn't know it was a study. So to basically separate these users into introverts and extroverts, you used an automated text-based personality approach, which I think is super cool. So can you outline how you kind of brought that into the experiment and how effective it was at classifying people?
Yeah, sure. So for the experiment, we had to find out what people's personality traits are, because that is a necessary precondition if you want to target them based on their personality, of course. So we had two options. Either we could simply ask them to answer some survey questions assessing their personality traits, which is, let's say, the conventional way of doing it in the social sciences, or we could use an algorithm to make the personality prediction for us. And that is exactly what we did. So we teamed up with TextGain, which is a spin-off company from the University of Antwerp, and they are specialized in predictive text analytics. So it was founded a couple of years ago by someone that I know from my period back in Antwerp. His name is Guy de Pauw. And TextGain offers personality profiling as one of their services. So this means that they have an algorithmic classifier that predicts people's personality and more precisely whether people are introvert or extrovert based on their own text. So basically based on their own writing style. So what we did in our experiment is collect all the text data that our participant had posted on our mock social networking site, so comments, their bios, etc. And based on that, the classifier could then return a response to us whether a person was introvert or extrovert. So that was a really interesting tool to use in the research.
Absolutely. And, I think the interesting thing is you kind of ask the participants like, hey, here's a social network, can you fill in, whatever you'd like? And of course, there's this about me section where I think that would really give some signals to the algorithm. But I'm curious, do you have an idea about, like what types of text or what types of keywords might have classified someone as an extrovert or an introvert?
Yeah, well, that is a tough question to answer because the algorithmic classifier has been trained on very large amounts of textual data from people who volunteered their personality profiles, and this consists of labeled data compiled from written essays, a large amount of social media posts, and so on. So it's really hard to specifically pinpoint the exact words that would classify someone as either introvert or extrovert. It's rather a whole pattern that is being discovered in someone's writing style that really does the job. But for us, it was really important to find out whether the classifier was effective. So we also checked this by comparing the results of the classifier with people's self-reported personality. And we did find that there is a significant relationship between both. So it means that both methods often end up with the same prediction. Is it 100% the same? No, but still, we do think that the classifier is a really interesting tool that needs further exploration in future research to really find its true potential, I would say.
Right. So what you're saying is that it's this classic kind of machine learning dilemma where the classifier works, but we don't know exactly why it works because that's kind of the nature of machine learning.
Exactly. So it's indeed trained based on a lot of volunteer data, and it's really hard to then specifically pick out the exact words that do the trick or do the job. So it's more about a whole complex pattern structure of writing style that tilts someone towards the result of being introvert or extrovert.
Right. Right. So after you filtered out users who didn't, have enough text put in for the classifier, or they didn't opt in to participate, you ended up with 75 introverts and 81 extroverts. It was a pretty good split there. So once you have these participants classified, what type of stimuli did you design and how were they varied?
Yeah. So after knowing whether people were introvert or extrovert, we had to provide them an ad that was either congruent or incongruent with this personality trait. So we did this by changing the framing of the text in the ad. So we basically dived into the field of linguistics to get some inspiration. And based on this literature review, we knew exactly which specific words we had to use in the ad to better target, match introversion and extroversion. And besides using exact or specific words, we also used stronger language for extroverts and weaker language for introverts, for instance. So this is how we did it. We really tried to find some linguistic patterns for both personality characteristics and then also target the ad based on these insights.
Right. It's important to note that the ads were coming from the political party GroenLinks, which is a left-wing party in the Netherlands. And then all your participants were also left-wing. You sort of asked them before if they would be about their political leanings. So it's sort of ideologically consistent or controlled. And then what you're testing is basically just this introversion versus extroversion text.
Exactly. Yeah. Because we really wanted to make sure that we are only targeting the people that were of interest, because that is exactly also what happens out there on social media. You're not going to convince a right-wing voter to vote for a left-wing party based on an ad. So usually you're looking for people within the same ideological spectrum, and then based on that pool of people, you try to really give them a gentle push in the back to convince them to eventually vote for your party. So, and that is what we did. We targeted the left-leaning participants and really look into whether it is possible to increase political persuasion based on a personality perspective.
Right, which I think is super cool. And before we get to the findings, which I'm sure everyone is curious about, I want to ask about the checks before running the experiment, because I think these are interesting. So you conducted a realism check to see if participants found the mock-up social network credible, and they did. And you also conducted a suspicion check to make sure participants didn't know the actual motive of the experiment, and none of them did. But I'm curious, because they were asked to put in, their thoughts about what the experiment was about. What did they think it was about?
It was really good to see basically that most people found the social network to be relatively realistic. At least that was what came out of the realism check. And as for the suspicion check, so as a cover story, we told the participants that our university developed this new kind of social network and that they would conduct sort of a usability test, so user experience test for the platform. So when we then asked them at the end of the experiment about what they thought was the real purpose of the experiment, a majority of them just said something along the lines of, it was to test the usability of the network. So that was the majority of participants. And others were a bit more clever and thought that there was something else going on, but virtually no one knew that we were collecting their written text to then target them with a political ad afterwards. And this was really important for the experiment to know whether people were aware or guessing in the right direction, but no one did.
Right, because that's kind of like what happens in real life, right? You don't know your data is being collected and you're being targeted with political ads.
Yeah, exactly.
At least a few years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so to the big reveal, what did this first experiment find out?
All right, so the big moments. So we found evidence that people are more persuaded when they receive a political ad containing a text that is tailored based on their own personality. So an ad congruent with their personality. And what do I mean with being more persuaded, because this is still a bit vague, I think. Well, we focused on two dependent variables: attitude towards the political party in the ad, which was in this case indeed the left-wing political party GroenLinks in the Netherlands. And we also focused on the intention to vote for that party. So we specifically found that personality congruent political ads was basically more effective in influencing people's attitudes and voting intention. So it was pretty interesting to see this pattern emerge in our data.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you'd expect to find, based on the literature that's out there and the case that you build for it. But I think it's interesting also to show it and also quantify that effect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was indeed like in line with what we thought, but still it was a whole endeavor to create the environment, to then also manipulate the stimuli and to get people to see the ad and then hope that the ad would work in the expected direction. So it was a whole complex setup, and it is really, we are fortunate to then also see the results, let's say, being confirmed. In a way, it is a bit confronting to see that political persuasion can be really triggered to a greater extent when they are being targeted based on their personality. But it was indeed in line with the expectations based on the scientific literature.
Right. And then that's only one experiment in that study, because the second one goes a bit deeper into the role of emotions, which is interesting. So the basic setup of that experiment is the same, except you used right-wing participants and showed them an ad from a right-wing party, I think a center-right party, right? So not the Geert Wilders party.
No, a center-right party, yeah.
Right, center-right party. I get confused because there are always like 2 or 3 letters, PVV or VVD.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyways, but this time the focus was on specific emotions, and those were fear and enthusiasm. So why look at these emotions, and particularly these two, fear and enthusiasm?
Yeah, so indeed, we conducted a second experiment, and because of a couple of things that we had in mind. First of all, we just wanted to conceptually replicate the findings of the first study with a different set of manipulations. But secondly, we also wanted to somehow extend these findings by also focusing on emotions. Now, why is that important? Because one of the main concerns regarding the practice of political micro-targeting on social media is the possibility to develop ad campaigns that use inappropriate emotional appeals to influence citizens' decision-making. So ads that use emotions to tap into the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses of voters. And that is why we also wanted to explore this emotional side of the whole story. Why this specific choice for fear and enthusiasm as emotional appeals? Well, that was just based on the academic literature. So it has been found that fear and enthusiasm appeals are often being used in political advertising campaigns, where enthusiasm include ads that are associated with success and good times in society, whereas fear appeals refer to ads associated with threats in our society. So these two appeals were often used, and therefore we thought were an ideal basis for the second experiment.
Yeah, and they also align well with the kind of introvert-extrovert dimension, right?
Yeah.
I think you hypothesized that introverts would be motivated more by fear, and then extroverts would be motivated by enthusiasm, which makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So also that was indeed covered by the literature as well, that specific personality traits, introversion versus extroversion, might respond differently with regards to the emotional appeal. And it was also hypothesized in our research that fear appeal would work better among introverts, and an enthusiasm appeal would work better among extroverts. So that was also the expectation in our study.
And was that actually what turned out to be the case?
Yeah, so we did also find evidence for this. We had 2 dependent variables, but we only could support the findings for the dependent variable voting intention and not for political attitudes. But we did find that the fear appeal was more effective in increasing voting intentions among introverts as compared to extroverts, and that the enthusiasm appeal was particularly effective in altering voting intentions among the extroverts. So there was the interaction that was significant in this second experiment. Yeah.
Definitely, which is super cool. But there's also this role of message elaboration, which comes into the second experiment, and that turns out to be a pretty important mechanism. So, can you elaborate on message elaboration in terms of what role it plays in the outcome of the experiment?
So, message elaboration refers to how much mental efforts people put into processing a message, and we tested this variable as a mediator with the reasoning that a political ad that is congruent with someone's personality will lead to an increase in careful elaboration of the ad, which in turn then should generate higher voting intentions or an increased political persuasion. And that was exactly what we found. So this mediated relationship was also supported by our data, so pointing towards message elaboration as the underlying mechanism.
So to kind of put that in simple terms, just see if I also understand it, it's that if you see an ad that kind of aligns with your personality preferences, or like an emotion that the valence of the emotion goes in the direction that your personality type would be. So if you get an enthusiastic ad and you're an enthusiastic person, you put more cognitive effort into paying attention to that ad, which seems to heighten the effects on, for example, voting intentions.
I couldn't have summarized that better.
I don't know if that was the simplest way.
That was a perfect summary of the whole study, I would say. Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly what we found. Yeah.
Cool. And so I think what's interesting about this type of research, and especially the findings, is that, you're looking at the Dutch case, which is quite interesting in that it has so many parties running, right? It's a multi-party system with, 28 parties running in a national election. But I think that the focus on personality traits and how those interact with emotions kind of runs across cultures. Like, it doesn't really matter what the party system is, because you're appealing to kind of, human personality traits. So what do you think these studies' findings mean for the role of social media ads, particularly in the context of political advertising?
So I think that the main takeaway is that tailoring based on citizens' psychometric profile might be something that really works. Although there are scholars and experts out there that claim that personality-based micro-targeting should be taken with a grain of salt, and so really questioning its effectiveness, we understand that claim, and we need much more research and much more evidence on this topic to really claim that it truly works. But the reality is that right now, there are companies all over the world that offer personality congruent targeting as an off-the-shelf service to any political actor willing to pay anywhere over the world. So this means that this type of targeting can easily be adopted in future political elections. And whatever impact it may have on these elections, even if it is very small, we think that it really deserves special attention in public discourse, because we're not simply talking about targeting based on age, gender, or interest. We're talking about targeting based on personality, which is a person's inner disposition, something that refers to their inner vulnerabilities. And that is something we really have to be careful with. And I think that this would be the main message or the main takeaway of this study.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I think, the kind of path has been that Cambridge Analytica makes these claims. Everyone says, oh, this explains Trump and Brexit. And then people start saying, no, it's not that effective. And then now there's empirical evidence that suggests it is effective. And that's why I think it's so interesting that it's kind of, your study really pulls that debate, I think, back to its original point, which is we should really look into this.
Yeah, exactly. So we really hope that we provided a small piece of the puzzle to disentangle this whole complex story of, does it work or is it a myth? So we think that we provided some initial insights into claiming that for some people, under some circumstances, it could really make a difference in swaying people to vote for a party.
Definitely. Super interesting. All right. So that's the first round of experiments. And I'd briefly like to run through your other study on chatbots, because while political targeted ads have kind of been around, for a while, although the evidence isn't really there too much yet, I think we'll see chatbots popping up in both the commercial space and the political space as the technology develops. And so I think what's really cool about your study is this focus on the anthropomorphism of chatbots. So what were you looking to study with chatbots, and how does anthropomorphism kind of fit into the picture?
Yeah, horrible word, anthropomorphism. I had to practice myself before I could really pronounce that word correctly. So yeah, indeed, this is another study, and I conducted this with Mikola, Mariella, and Theo at the University of Amsterdam. And in this study, we specifically focused on news chatbots. So the last couple of years, we are indeed seeing more and more news companies trying to use chatbots as a channel for disseminating short news content. Usually very small conversation-sized chunks of news updates. And I think everyone knows these kind of chatbots. They're typically integrated in private messaging apps such as Facebook Messenger. And by distributing news through chatbots, we can somehow say that it is a more conversational, social, and interactive way of disseminating news. And indeed, an important notion in this study was, you already referred to it, the horrible word of anthropomorphism. Essentially, it refers to chatbots being perceived to have human-like characteristics due to their conversational nature. So chatbots are being assigned human-like features. And from research, we know that when people talk to a chatbot with human-like features, they are putting considerable efforts into establishing a common ground with the chatbot. So really considering middle ground for discussion. So based on this knowledge, we thought, maybe news chatbots could be a promising tool to lower the threshold for people to engage with opposing or conflicting perspectives in news content and encourage them to rethink their initial attitudinal positions on specific issues. And that is exactly what we investigated in this study.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's been a lot of focus on algorithms recommending news, or friends recommending news. But I think the chatbot aspect is super interesting. So could you walk us through the design of that experiment, kind of the main factors you were trying to test?
Yeah, sure. So there were essentially two factors. The first factor was how we disseminated the news, so either through a chatbot or either through a traditional news website. And the second factor included the article of the news, so the framing of the article. So either in line with a person's own attitude or conflicting with a person's own attitude. So basically, again, congruent or incongruent, where incongruent then would mean that it contains opposing views. And in this study, we chose a highly divisive news topic, which is migration. So the design was rather straightforward. First, participants started with a screening question to assess their attitude towards immigrants. And this allowed us to determine whether they are predominantly pro or anti-immigration, which was important to, of course, determine whether a specific news article is either congruent or incongruent with their own attitudes. And after knowing this, they were then randomly either receiving a chatbot news article or a website news article. So that was the basic setup of the study.
And then sort of what were the key findings that came out of it?
So in short, people were more likely to accept opposing news content when it was provided by a chatbot. So maybe a bit elaborating on this, we found that people agreed more to a news article containing opposing views on migration when it was delivered by a news chatbot compared to the exact same article on an online news website. They also perceived this opposing news article as more credible when it was provided by the chatbots. And anthropomorphism was the explaining mechanism here as well. So we found that the chatbot news article really activated people's perceptions of the chatbot being social and having human-like characteristics, which may have led to the increase in agreement and credibility of the news article containing these conflicting or opposing views. So our conclusion was then that these findings might suggest that news chatbots may be interesting tools to trigger people to see both sides of an argument, to consider some middle ground for a discussion, and to reflect on their own views. So a very interesting thing to look into in future research as well.
Definitely. And I want to break down, without going too much into the specifics of the difference between the mindless and mindful anthropomorphism. Which was, if I recall, when people were exposed to the chatbot, they got a message like, "Good day, how are you today?" Before they presented the news, and the avatar of the chatbot is kind of smiling. And then you ask participants basically two different questions, or there were two groups. one was asked to rate the chatbot on how human-like or machine-like it was. And then the other group was asked to rate the chatbot on how friendly or sociable it was. And it seems that when you sort of primed participants with the more kind of social question, with this very social chatbot, that seemed to be a key role in whether they were more open to this incongruent news. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's true. So we did test two mechanisms, so the mindless, but also the mindful anthropomorphism. And it was especially the mindless anthropomorphism that did the job. So so when you ask people plainly, like, was this chatbot containing machine-like features or human-like, that didn't really work too well. But if you really try to ask them questions about the social nature, the interactive nature of the chatbot, then they generate much higher scores on mindless anthropomorphism. So anthropomorphism on a more implicit level, so to say. And that was the underlying mechanism that we found in our study that generated the increase in agreement and the increase in credibility of the news article that contained conflicting views.
Right. And that was the most interesting for me. It's like if let's say you're anti-migration and you get this pro-migration news article, but the chatbot's very friendly, and then you're asked to think about that friendly chatbot. It seems like there's something going on there with the design of the chatbot being friendly or sociable that makes people more likely to be at least open to that incongruent news.
Yeah, so that's true. So we are well aware that how the chatbot was designed is a choice that we had to make, and is also a choice that could influence how the results are turning out. So we developed the chatbot to, in a, let's say, rather fun, engaging conversation formats. It included a smiling avatar. It included also some smileys. So it could perfectly be that this choice for positive elements in the chatbot works better for certain people. And so the way a chatbot is being designed is highly decisive in also generating which responses are going to follow. So that is also something that really has to be taken into account when interpreting the results of this study.
Yeah, because my last question for you has to do with kind of combining these two studies, which is, this chatbot is in some ways very enthusiastic, which is something that you tested in your first study. So do you think there might be a relationship between, from the participants' personality traits, their receptiveness to this counter-attitudinal news based on the design of the chatbot?
Well, this is a tough question, actually. So we know that extroverts are often described as talkative, social, and open-minded when it comes to entering a specific discussion about a given topic. So I would say that based on these characteristics, and I have to be careful here because I'm just guessing, but we might expect that extroverts are maybe more open to agree with a counter-attitudinal news article when it is provided by a highly social and conversational engines, in this case a chatbot. So even more so if they can also enter into a discussion with the chatbot about the specific news item, then it could really open up the possibility for them to rethink their initial positions about the topic, at least if they are convinced by what the chatbot responds during the conversation. So I think this is a really interesting question, and as an academic, I think I have to say at this point, hey, this would make an excellent future research idea. So it's a really interesting thought.
Well, definitely these studies had me rethinking a bit about the effectiveness of political ads. So it's super great work. And Dr. Zarouali, thanks for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Brahim Zarouali, Assistant Professor of Persuasive Communication at the University of Amsterdam. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Ned Hoey, CEO of Tectonica, which is a digital organizing firm that's built websites for political parties across Europe. And we'll talk about the role that websites play in digital organizing in a European context. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.